The crack of the rifle was a splinter of sound in the vast, heat-shimmered silence of the Badlands. Dust, the color of rust and blood, billowed from the hooves of the six-horse team as the stagecoach careened down the narrow canyon pass. From his vantage point on the ridge, Jedediah Jed Carter had seen the ambush unfold. He hadn't been looking for trouble. In this life, he did his best to look the other way. But the driver, a young man named Billy, with a new wife back in redemption, had taken a bullet to the chest in the first volley. His body was a limp sack on the driver's box. Jed spurred his buckskin, plunging down the scree-laden slope, his old Colt Peacemaker already in his hand. The instinct, buried for a decade under layers of grief and solitude, was as sharp as ever. Lawman. The word was a ghost on his tongue. He was a rancher, now a man who spoke more to his cattle than to people. But he couldn't watch this. He came in low and fast, using the coach as a moving shield. The robbers, 5 of them, were focused on bringing the panicked horses to a stop. The sun glinted off a rifle barrel, and Jed felt a searing heat slice across his left arm. He ignored it, firing twice. One of the riders screamed and tumbled from his saddle, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. "Get the box," a voice roared, raw and commanding. The leader. He was a big man on a powerful black stallion, his face obscured by a dusty bandana. As the man wheeled his horse to fire at Jed, the animal reared its flank, exposed for a single fleeting moment. And Jed saw it. Branded into the horse's hide was a coiled serpent, a snake eating its own tail. The world seemed to stop. The thunder of hooves, the shouts, the gunfire, it all receded into a dull hum. The image burned into his mind, a key turning a lock on a room he had sealed shut 10 years ago. A room filled with smoke and fire and the ghosts of a woman and a child. His hesitation cost him. A bullet ripped through the meat of his shoulder, spinning him half around in the saddle. His vision swam with black spots. Through the haze, he saw the robbers wrench a single heavily guarded lockbox from the coach's boot. It wasn't the mailbags or the passengers' valuables they were after. Just that box. The leader gave a sharp command, and the gang galloped away, their forms dissolving into the shimmering heat. They left behind a dead driver, terrified passengers huddled inside the coach, and Jed Carter bleeding in the dust, haunted by a symbol he thought he had buried with his family. He clutched his wounded shoulder, the physical pain, a dull echo of the agony roaring back to life in his soul. The past he now knew was not dead. It wasn't even past. It had just been waiting. The sun was a merciless hammer against the parched earth by the time Jed made it back to his ranch, Carter's Claim. The place was as spare and weathered as he was. A small, sturdy cabin, his own hands had built a barn, a corral, and a single stubborn cottonwood tree standing sentinel over a pair of unmarked graves on a nearby hill. He slumped from his horse, the pain in his arm and shoulder, a throbbing fire. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of pine wood and old sorrow. He tore a strip from a clean shirt, and his teeth clenched against the pain-poured raw whiskey over the gash on his arm before binding it tightly. The shoulder wound was worse, a deep puncture that would ache for weeks. He cleaned it as best he could, his movements practiced and detached. He had tended his own wounds for years. It was the other kind, the ones on the inside that never seemed to mend. His life here was a ritual of isolation. He rose before the sun worked until it set and fell into an exhausted sleep, praying for a night free of dreams. The ranch was all he had left of them. Of Sarah with her laugh that could gentle the wildest Mustang, and little Sammy whose small hand had fit so perfectly in his. They had died in a fire, a freak accident with a fallen lantern, the sheriff had said. A tragedy. Jed had accepted it because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. He had quit his marshal's badge the next day, trading the law for 160 acres of lonely silence. This land was his penance, his memorial, his prison. The world outside his fences had slowly been consumed by one man, Silas Thorne. Thorne had arrived 5 years ago with a seemingly endless supply of Eastern money and a vision of progress that involved railroads, mines, and owning every square inch of the territory. He had bought out the smaller ranches one by one, his offers always too generous to refuse. He was a pillar of the community. He was building a man who spoke of schools and churches, while his agents quietly and efficiently dismantled the old way of life. All that remained outside his grasp was Carter's claim. Thorne had made several offers, each more lucrative than the last. He'd visited personally, his demeanor always polite, his words laced with a silken persuasion that made Jed's skin crawl. Jed had refused every time. The land wasn't for sale. It was consecrated ground, fertilized with his own heartbreak. He knew what the townsfolk in Redemption thought. They saw him as a stubborn old fool standing in the way of prosperity. Redemption itself was no longer the dusty but decent town he remembered. It was Thorne's town now. The storefronts bore his name, the bank held his money, and the law wore his brand. Sheriff Cobb, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically removed and replaced with a stack of Thorne's dollars, kept the peace, Thorne's peace. Jed had seen it in Cobb's shifty eyes the last time he'd been in town for supplies. The law in Redemption served one man, and it wasn't the man with the tin star. It was the man with the gold-plated ambition. Jed sank onto his cot, and the pain in his shoulder radiating through his chest. He closed his eyes, but the image of the coiled serpent was seared onto the back of his eyelids. It was the brand of the Black Creek Raiders, a vicious gang he had pursued relentlessly in his martial days. They were thieves and killers, but they were guns for hire above all else. Someone had paid them to hit that stagecoach to steal that specific lockbox. And that someone Jed suspected with a cold, sinking certainty was the same man who wanted this land. But why, the question gnawed at him, a fresh wound layered over the old. 2 days later, the dust of an approaching buggy signaled the arrival of a visitor. Jed watched from his porch, his hand resting near the butt of his holstered Colt. He didn't get visitors. Silas Thorne stepped down from the buggy dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the rugged landscape. He was a handsome man with silvering temples and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and clear. "Carter." Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultured. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, not daring to presume an invitation. "I trust I'm not disturbing you." "You are," Jed said flatly. His arm was in a sling, his face set like granite. Thorne's eyes flickered to the sling. "An accident, I hope." "A disagreement." A thin smile played on Thorne's lips. "Ah, yes. Disagreements. They seem to be a feature of this rugged country. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. I am here to make you one final offer for this property. A most generous one. Enough to set you up anywhere you'd like. A quiet life away from disagreements." "The answer's the same as it was last time." Jed said, his voice low. "This land isn't for sale." Thorne's pleasant demeanor didn't change, but the cold in his eyes intensified. He took a step closer. "Everything is for sale, Carter. It is simply a matter of price. You are a man clinging to ghosts. This valley has a future of industry, of prosperity. This little plot of sentimentality is an impediment. Progress has a way of clearing its own path. Unforeseen hardships often befall those who stand in its way. Fires, accidents. The land can be unforgiving." The veiled threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jed's hand tightened on the grip of his pistol. He remembered the fire that took his family, the smell of smoke and charred wood. An accident. I think you should leave now, Thorn. Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. Thorn held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. As you wish. But do consider my offer. It is the last one you will receive. He turned and walked back to his buggy, a figure of dark elegance against the sun-bleached landscape. Jed watched until the buggy was a speck on the horizon. He spent the rest of the day on edge, cleaning his rifle, checking the perimeter of his property, his senses screaming that something was wrong. That night, he was woken by the frantic whinnying of his horses. He bolted upright, the smell hitting him an instant later. Smoke. Thick, acrid smoke. He burst out of the cabin and saw it. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno against the black velvet of the night sky. The fire danced and writhed, a monstrous living thing casting demonic shadows that clawed at the walls of his cabin. It was the same unnatural speed, the same all-consuming rage. It was the fire from his nightmares. He raced toward the inferno, his only thought for the animals trapped inside. He smashed the corral gate open, his heart pounding against his ribs, as his two horses, panicked and wild-eyed, galloped out into the night. He tried to get to the barn door to save the tack and the feed, the tools that were his livelihood, but the heat was a solid wall driving him back. He could only stand there helpless as the structure that had taken him a year to build collapsed into a heap of glowing embers. The message was as clear as the serpent brand on the horse. This was no business negotiation. This was a war, and Silas Thorne had just burned away the last of Jed Carter's desire for a quiet life. He was no longer just a rancher. The lawman, the man he thought he had buried, was wide awake. The sun was barely cresting the eastern mountains when Jed rode into redemption. He bypassed the new Thorne-funded saloon and the mercantile, heading straight for the sheriff's office. The town was quiet, but it was the quiet of a place holding its breath. Jed swung down from his horse, the smoldering ruins of his barn still burning in his mind's eye, and pushed through the door. Sheriff Cobb was sitting with his boots on his desk, nursing a cup of coffee. He was a portly man with a florid face and eyes that perpetually darted about as if looking for the safest place to land. He looked up as Jed entered, and a flicker of unease crossed his features. "Carter," he said, swinging his boots to the floor. "What brings you to town so early? More trouble?" "My barn burned to the ground last night." Jed said, his voice flat and hard. "I want to report it as arson." Cobb sighed, rubbing his face. "Arson now, Jed. Let's not jump to conclusions. It's been dry. A stray spark, an overturned lantern. These things happen. It happened right after Silas Thorne paid me a visit and threatened me." Jed countered, stepping closer to the desk. "He wants my land, Cobb. You know that. This was his way of persuading me to sell." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wouldn't meet Jed's gaze. "Thorne, he's a respectable man, a benefactor to this town. Why would he resort to something like that? You have any proof?" "The timing is the proof," Jed snapped. "I want you to ride out to his estate, ask him where he was last night." Cobb let out a short, dismissive laugh. "And what accuse the most powerful man in the territory of burning down a barn because you've got a hunch I can't do that, Jed? It was probably just vagrants looking for a warm place to sleep. I'll post a notice, but unless you have a witness, there's nothing I can do." Jed stared at the man, the tin star on his chest, a mockery of everything it was supposed to represent. He saw the truth clearly. Cobb wasn't just on Thorne's payroll. He was a gatekeeper paid to ensure the law never inconvenienced his master. Arguing was pointless. He was alone. The law was a closed door. He turned and walked out, leaving Cobb to his coffee and his cowardice. There was only one other person in Redemption who might listen, who might still believe that the truth mattered more than money. He found Arthur Finn in the small, cramped office of the Redemption Chronicle, a newspaper that was more a weekly pamphlet than a serious publication. The air smelled of ink and lead type. Arthur was a slight man with spectacles perched on his nose and a perpetually worried expression. He had come west for his health and stayed for the stories, though the stories he wanted to print were rarely the ones the town wanted to read. "Jedediah," Arthur said, looking up from his printing press in surprise. "It's been a long time. What can I do for you?" Jed laid it all out: the stagecoach robbery, the coiled serpent brand Thorne's visit, and the fire. He spoke in a low, even tone, but Arthur could see the cold fury simmering beneath the surface. When Jed finished, Arthur took off his spectacles and polished them with a corner of his ink-stained shirt, a nervous habit. "Silas Thorne," he murmured. "I've been chronicling his acquisitions. Quietly. There are whispers, Jed. Stories of families' intimidated water rights, mysteriously drying up deeds with forged signatures. But no one will speak on the record. They're too afraid." "I'm not afraid anymore," Jed said. "I need your help, Arthur. You know how to find information. That lockbox, the robbers took what was in it, and the brand, the Black Creek Raiders. I thought they were wiped out years ago." Arthur's eyes, magnified by his spectacles, held a mixture of fear and journalistic excitement. "This is dangerous, Jed. Thorne practically owns this town. If he finds out we're digging—" "He's already tried to burn me out," Jed replied grimly. "How much more dangerous can it get? I'm not asking you to ride with a gun. I'm asking you to do what you do best. Find the truth." Arthur hesitated for a long moment, the press silent beside him. He looked at the headline he was setting: "Thorne pledges funds for new schoolhouse." A lie of omission. The real story was the one standing right in front of him. "All right, Jed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll help. I can send a wire to a contact at the territorial capital about that stagecoach manifest. See what was listed for that lockbox. As for the Raiders, that will be harder. It means digging into your old life." He put his spectacles back on, and his gaze was steady. "Be careful, my friend. You're stirring up a nest of snakes." "I know," Jed said, turning to leave. "One of them already has a name." Jed and Arthur met in secret over the next few days, their investigation a clandestine dance, in a town where Thorne's eyes were everywhere. Arthur's contact in the capital wired back the lockbox stolen from the stagecoach was registered to the Western Geological Survey Company, a subsidiary of Thorne Industries. It contained geological surveys and mineral rights assessments for the entire valley, including the land surrounding Carter's claim. "He's not just buying up ranch land," Arthur explained, spreading the maps across the table in his back office. "He's consolidating a mineral empire. These surveys must pinpoint the richest deposits. Your land, Jed, it must be sitting on something valuable." "It's never been about the grazing," Jed mused, tracing the outline of his property with a calloused finger. "But why the secrecy? Why not just make me an offer based on the mineral rights?" "Leverage," Arthur suggested. "If the strike becomes public knowledge, the price skyrockets. This way he can acquire the land for a fraction of its worth. It's ruthless, but it's how men like him operate." The coiled serpent brand was a more difficult puzzle. Jed dredged up memories he had long suppressed, recalling names and faces from his marshal days. The Black Creek Raiders had been led by a man named Dutch Van Horn, a notoriously cruel outlaw. Jed had tracked them for months, cornering them in a shootout that had left most of the gang, including Van Horn, dead. or so he had thought. If some of them survived, they'd be loyal to whoever paid them the most, Jed said. And Thorn has the deepest pockets in the territory. It was during his search for any sign of the raiders' return that his path crossed with two unexpected figures. He was riding the southern fence line of his property, an area of rugged hills and dense juniper, when he saw them. Two women crouched by a cluster of rocks. For a moment his hand went to his gun, his mind flashing to Thorn's men. But as he drew closer, he saw they were not a threat. They were Apache. The older one rose as he approached her posture, wary and proud. The younger sister stayed close behind her, her dark eyes wide and observant. "You're on private land," Jed said, his voice neutral. He kept his horse at a distance, not wanting to spook them. "This land was not private when our ancestors were buried here." The older one replied, her voice steady. Her name, he would learn, was Ayanna. "What do you want?" Jed asked. It was the younger sister, Kaya, who spoke, her voice softer than her sister's. "We came to see the stones, the resting place of our family, but they have been disturbed." She gestured toward a small, secluded hollow Jed had rarely visited. He dismounted and followed them. The place was a small natural sanctuary, but it had been desecrated. The ground was torn up, riddled with fresh pits dug by shovels. Sacred burial markers, simple flat stones, arranged in patterns, had been tossed aside like common rocks. A cold anger coiled in Jed's gut. "Thorn's men," Ayanna said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "We have watched them from the hills. They come at night. They are digging, searching for something." Jed looked at the disturbed earth, then back at the maps in his memory. This remote corner of his property, according to the stolen surveys, was flagged as having significant geological potential. "They think there's gold here," Jed said grimly, "or silver." "There is nothing here but the bones of our people," Ayanna stated. "But they will not stop. This is why we approached you. We cannot fight them alone." They weren't asking for shelter or protection in the way a helpless victim would. They were offering an alliance. They were warriors defending their home, just as he was. "What do you know about this land?" Jed asked, looking at the sisters with new respect. "We know its secrets," Kaya said. "The high trails the white men do not see. The hidden springs. The caves where a man can watch the whole valley unseen." Ayanna watched him, her gaze intense. "Thorn is your enemy. He is our enemy. The land does not care what color a man's skin is. It only knows those who respect it and those who tear it apart." "Which are you, rancher?" In that moment, Jed Carter made a choice. He was no longer a man alone. "My name is Jedediah," he said, "and I think you can help me." The sisters, guardians of the land's ancient memory, became his eyes and ears. Their deep knowledge of the terrain, passed down through generations, was a weapon Thorn's money could never buy. Following Ayanna's guidance, Jed found a hidden game trail that led to a high ridge overlooking the desecrated burial site. From there, he could watch Thorn's men without being seen. They came, as the sisters had said, under the cover of darkness, their lanterns casting eerie dancing shadows as they dug with a frantic energy. But they weren't just digging randomly. They were focused on one particular spot at the crumbling foundation of an old homesteader's cabin, abandoned for 50 years. Jed waited until they left their curses hanging in the pre-dawn air, their search apparently fruitless. With the first light of day, he made his way down to the ruins. The ground was freshly turned, but the men had missed something. Tucked beneath the massive, unmovable hearthstone of the old chimney was a loose rock. Jed worked it free with the tip of his knife. Behind it was a dark cavity. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against cold, damp wood. He pulled it out. It was a small, iron-strapped box, heavy for its size. It wasn't treasure. It was a cellar door concealed for decades. With a groan of rusted hinges, he lifted it. A wave of musty air smelling of earth and time washed over him. He lit a match and descended the rough-hewn stone steps into the darkness. The cellar was small and dry. In the flickering matchlight, he saw old canning jars, a broken chair, and in a corner, a small wooden chest. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but it was not rotten. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among yellowed linens, were several leather-bound ledgers and a small personal journal. He carried them back up into the light. The ledgers were filled with columns of numbers and names, records of transactions, shipments, and payments. He recognized some of the names powerful figures in the territorial government, railroad magnates, men he had investigated years ago for a far-reaching criminal conspiracy involving land fraud and illegal government contracts. He had gotten close, too close, but his key witness had been murdered, and the case had fallen apart. Then he opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. His breath caught in his throat. It was Sarah's. His wife had been a bookkeeper before they married, meticulous and brilliant with numbers. He had never known she continued her work. He sat on the cold ground, the sun rising over the valley, and began to read. The journal started as a record of her suspicions. She had taken a small job auditing books for one of Thorne's early ventures and had stumbled upon an irregularity, a thread she couldn't stop pulling. The entries detailed a shadow network of bribery, extortion, and murder, all orchestrated by one man, at the center of the web, Silas Thorne. He wasn't just building a business empire. He was the mastermind behind the very conspiracy Jed had failed to unravel a decade ago. Thorne wasn't after gold or silver in these hills. He was after this cellar. He was hunting for the evidence that could destroy him. Sarah had found it, recorded it, and hidden it away. Jed's hands trembled as he turned to the final entry dated the day before the fire. "He knows," she wrote. "I saw it in his eyes today. He knows I have the ledgers. Jed must never find out about this until it is safe. This man Thorne, he is not who he seems. He is a phantom, a man without a past. But he is a monster. I fear he will stop at nothing to silence me. I have hidden the proof in the old homesteader's cellar. If anything happens to me, this is the only thing that can bring him to justice. I pray it will not come to that. I pray I can see my husband and my sweet Sammy grow old." Jed closed the journal, the world collapsing into a single, agonizing point of understanding. The fire. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. It was arson. Thorne hadn't just taken his future. He had stolen his past, murdering his wife to cover his crimes, and in the process had killed his son. The fight was no longer about a ranch. It was no longer about progress or mineral rights. It was about vengeance. He stood up, the journal clutched in his hand. The weight of it was no longer ink and paper, but blood and bone. 10 years of grief curdled into a cold, hard resolve. He would not bring Silas Thorne to justice. He would bring him to the grave. The news that Jed had found the cellar and its contents must have traveled fast through Thorne's network of spies. The ranch hand he'd fired a month ago, the chatty clerk at the general store, anyone could have been an informant. The retaliation was swift and cruel, a move designed not to intimidate, but to break him. Jed was meeting with Arthur in his print shop, showing him the damning evidence in Sarah's ledgers, when Ayanna burst through the door, her face a mask of panic. "They have her," she gasped, her usual composure shattered. "Thorne's men, they took Kaya." Jed felt a cold dread wash over him. Kaya had gone to a secluded canyon to gather medicinal herbs, a place she thought was safe. She was the gentler of the two sisters, the one whose hope had been a small light in the growing darkness. They left a rider. Ayana continued, her voice trembling with rage. He carried a message. She looked at Jed, her eyes pleading. From Thorn. They rode back to the ranch at a gallop. A lone rider was waiting for them at the edge of Jed's property, holding a white flag. He was one of the men from the stagecoach robbery, his face hard and impassive. The Thorn has a proposal for you, Carter, the man said, his tone mocking. He admires your persistence. He's willing to make a trade. What trade? Jed demanded, his hand resting on his pistol. The girl for the books, the man said simply. Your wife's little diary and those ledgers. Bring them to the Devil's Mesa at sunset tomorrow. Come alone, he'll have the girl. You make the exchange and everyone walks away. You try anything and the girl dies. The rider wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving Jed with an impossible choice. The journal and ledgers were the only proof he had. They were the key to destroying Thorn, the justification for the vengeance that burned in his soul. Handing them over meant letting the man who murdered his family walk free. It meant Sarah's death would be for nothing. But refusing meant condemning Kaya to an unspeakable fate. The girl was innocent, caught in a war that wasn't hers. He saw her hopeful eyes, her gentle smile. He saw Ayana's terrified face. Could he sacrifice an innocent life for his own revenge? The question tore him apart. He stood in the dust of his own land, caught between the ghosts of his past and the demands of the present. Was he the lawman he used to be, the man who protected the innocent, or had Thorn's evil transformed him into a man of pure vengeance, willing to let the world burn as long as his enemy burned with it? He looked from the desolate horizon to Ayana's anguished face. The answer came to him clear and hard, and costing him a piece of his soul. Justice could wait. A life could not. Tell me everything you know about the Devil's Mesa, he said to Ayana, his voice raspy. The lawman had won, but the killer was taking notes. The Devil's Mesa was a stark and lonely place, a flat-topped butte that rose from the desert floor like a stone altar. The wind was a constant presence, a mournful whisper that carved the rock into skeletal shapes. As the sun began its descent, bleeding crimson and gold across the horizon, Jed rode toward the meeting point. A storm was brewing in the west, the clouds a dark, bruised purple, promising a violent night. The air was thick with tension, heavy and electric. He rode alone as instructed, with Sarah's journal and ledgers wrapped in oilskin in his saddlebag. But he was not without a plan. Ayana, her face a grim sculpture of determination, was hidden in the rocks miles away. A rifle in her hands and a signal mirror at her side. Arthur Finn had been dispatched on the fastest horse Jed owned, riding for the territorial capital, with a desperate message for the U.S. Marshals. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. Thorn was waiting for him at the center of the mesa, flanked by 4 of his men, including the brute who had led the stagecoach robbery. They had Kaya. She stood between them, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant. Carter, Thorn called out as Jed dismounted, his voice carrying on the wind. I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable. Where's the girl? Jed said, his eyes locked on Kaya. Right here, safe and sound for the moment, Thorn said with a placid smile. The books, if you please. Jed slowly unstrapped his saddlebag and held it up. Let her go first. She walks to me. Then you get what you came for. Thorn considered this for a moment, then nodded to one of his men who shoved Kaya forward. She stumbled, then walked toward Jed, her eyes never leaving his. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. "You have no idea what you've been interfering with, Carter." Thorne said, his voice taking on a new darker tone as Kaya reached Jed's side. "This is bigger than a piece of land. It's about building an empire, about remaking this miserable country in my own image." "It's about murder," Jed said, pushing Kaya behind him. "It's about my wife, my son." Thorne laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "Your wife was a sentimental fool just like you. She couldn't leave well enough alone. She had to pry to judge. She brought it on herself." He took a step forward, his polished facade finally cracking to reveal the predator beneath. "And you? You were always the favorite, weren't you? The good son, the righteous one. Even when Father cast me out, it was your name he spoke on his deathbed." Jed froze. The words made no sense. "My father? What do you know about my father?" Silas Thorne's smile was a terrible, twisted thing. The setting sun cast his face in shadow, making him look like a demon. "He was my father too, Jedediah." The world tilted. The wind howled, snatching the breath from Jed's lungs. He stared at the man before him, the tailored suit, the cultured voice, the cold ambition. And for the first time, he saw past it all. He saw the ghost of a boy he once knew. The dark hair, the sharp line of his jaw, the eyes that could turn to ice in an instant. Silas. Jed whispered the name, a strange and alien sound. His older brother Silas had been a wild seed disowned by their father after a bitter feud. He had run off, and word had come back years later that he had died of fever in a mining town. They had mourned him. I shed that name along with the rest of my pathetic past. Thorne sneered. I faked my death to be reborn. I built myself from nothing while you were content to play sheriff in some forgotten town. I built an empire on the foundations of the world you and Father held so dear. And you, little brother, were the final piece. Owning your land, the last vestige of the Carter name, was to be my final victory. The vendetta wasn't just criminal. It was fraternal. It was a lifetime of bitter jealousy and perceived slights festering into a monstrous hatred. This man hadn't just killed a stranger's wife. He had ordered the murder of his own sister-in-law, his own nephew. The revelation shattered Jed's quest for simple revenge. How could he kill his own brother, his own blood? As the question hung in the charged air, a flash of light caught his eye, a glint from the distant rocks. Ayana's signal. Arthur had made it through. Help was coming. At the same moment, Thorne saw it too, his face contorted with rage. "Kill them!" he screamed. The world exploded into chaos. The rising sandstorm engulfed the mesa, the wind screaming like a banshee. Gunshots cracked, muted by the gale. Jed shoved Kaya to the ground behind a rock and drew his Colt. It was no longer a simple shootout. It was a swirling nightmare of sand and shadows, a battle against phantoms. And at the heart of the storm was a fight between two brothers bound by blood and separated by an ocean of betrayal, a conflict that could only end in death. Through the blinding chaos of the sandstorm, Jed's lawman training took over. He became a creature of instinct and economy. He didn't fire wildly into the gloom. He listened, he waited, he moved. The wind was his ally, masking his footsteps, distorting the shouts of Thorne's men. A shadowy figure loomed to his left. He fired once. A grunt, a heavy fall. Another muzzle flashed to his right. He dropped, rolled, and fired twice at the source. He was a ghost in the storm, a force of retribution honed by years of tracking men in unforgiving country. He could feel Ayana's presence on the ridge, her rifle cracking with deadly precision, whenever the gale offered a moment's clarity, picking off Thorne's men one by one. They were caught in a vice. Finally, only two figures remained standing on the mesa, Jed and his brother. Silas, the name felt like ash in his mouth, stood near the edge of the cliff, his fine suit tattered, his face streaked with grime. He held a pistol, but his gaze was one of disbelief. "How?" Silas snarled, the wind tearing the word from his lips. "You were always just a simple man, a plodder. You forgot where we came from," Jed yelled back over the storm. "You forgot what Father taught us. You can't own the land, you can only serve it." Silas raised his pistol, his hand shaking with rage. "He loved you more." The shot went wide. Jed didn't return fire. He charged through the stinging sand, closing the distance between them. This wasn't a task for a bullet. This was something that had to be finished by hand. He slammed into his brother, and the gun went flying from Silas's grip. They wrestled on the edge of the abyss, two sides of the same coin locked in a desperate final struggle. Silas was strong, fueled by a lifetime of hatred, but Jed was stronger, powered by a grief that had finally found its purpose. He twisted, using Silas's own momentum against him, and threw him to the ground. He raised his fist, the image of Sarah and Sammy flashing in his mind. He could end it. He could deliver the vengeance he had craved. But as he looked down at his brother's terrified, hate-filled face, he saw not a monster, but a broken, lost man. Killing him would be an execution, not justice. It would make him no better than the man who gave the order to light the fire. With a guttural cry of anguish, Jed lowered his fist. He would not become him. Instead, he drew his pistol and brought the butt down hard on his brother's temple. Silas went limp. Justice, not vengeance. As if on cue, the sandstorm began to subside. Through the swirling dust, a new sound emerged, the thunder of approaching horses. A dozen riders crested the hill, led by a grim-faced U.S. Marshal. Arthur Finn rode beside him, his face pale but resolute. The posse surrounded them. The Marshal dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the bodies, the bound girl being comforted by an Apache woman emerging from the rocks, and Jed standing over the unconscious form of Silas Thorne. "Jedediah Carter?" the Marshal asked. Jed nodded, his shoulders slumping with an exhaustion so profound it was bone deep. "He's all yours, Marshal. Silas Thorne, for murder, conspiracy, and arson." Kaya ran to him, throwing her arms around him, tears of relief streaming down her face. Ayana placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The storm had finally broken. The first drops of rain began to fall, cool and clean, washing the dust and the blood from the sacred ground of the mesa. Exhausted but alive, the three of them, a broken rancher and two warrior sisters, began the long journey back to what was left of home. Weeks turned into a month. The town of Redemption exhaled a breath it hadn't known it was holding. With Silas Thorne and his key lieutenants imprisoned and awaiting a federal trial, his empire, built on fear and corruption, began to crumble. Sheriff Cobb quietly resigned and left town in the middle of the night. Arthur Finn's newspaper was flourishing, printing the long-suppressed stories of Thorne's victims, his articles syndicated in papers across the territory. A sense of cautious optimism settled over the valley like the green shoots of grass after a wildfire. At Carter's claim, life was being rebuilt. The barn was raised anew, a communal effort that brought Jed, Arthur, Ayana, Kaya, and a handful of their relatives together. The air, once thick with solitude and grief, was now filled with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and conversation in two languages. The ranch was no longer a prison of memory. It was becoming a sanctuary of hope. Jed, however, still felt a hollowness inside him. Justice had been served, but peace remained elusive. The ghost of his brother locked away in a federal cell haunted him as much as the ghosts of his wife and son. One evening, as he was sorting through the box of Sarah's belongings, he had recovered from the cellar, his fingers brushed against a hidden flap in the lining of her journal. Tucked inside was a single, unsealed letter. His name was on the front, written in her elegant script. With trembling hands, he opened it. "My dearest Jedediah," it began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and the secrets I kept have come to light. There is so much I must explain, but I fear time is short. The man who calls himself Silas Thorne, he is your brother. I discovered it by accident, a mention of your father's name in an old shipping manifest. I know this truth will wound you deeper than any other. I did not tell you because I saw the darkness in him, and I knew that pitting brother against brother would destroy the good man I love. Forgive me for my secrecy, But I am writing this for another reason. I know your heart, my love. It is a heart built for justice, but it is also capable of a terrible, consuming anger. Do not let vengeance be his final victory. Do not let hatred for your brother poison the rest of your days. I do not ask you to absolve him of his crimes, but I pray that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive the lost boy he once was. Forgive him not for his sake, but for yours. Free yourself. Live. Love again. That is all I have ever wanted for you. Yours forever, Sarah." Tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. For the first time in 10 years, Jed did not weep for what he had lost, but for what he had been given. A final gift from his wife, permission to heal. Permission to live. The next morning, he walked with Ayanna and Kaya to the desecrated burial ground. Their people had come down from the hills, and together they were carefully, lovingly restoring the sacred stones. He stood beside Ayanna, watching the quiet, dignified work. "My wife, she would have liked you." Jed said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have the same strength." Ayanna looked at him, her gaze soft, with an understanding that transcended words. "Our people have nowhere else to go. Thorne's mines have poisoned the river near our old lands." Jed looked at the rolling hills of his ranch, the newly built barn, and the small cabin. It was too much space for one man. "This is your land too." He said the words feeling more right than any he had ever spoken. "It was your ancestors long before it was mine. There is room enough here, for all of you. Let us build a new home, together." A slow smile spread across Ayanna's face, and Kaya, who stood nearby, beamed. That evening, the first of the new lodges was being raised near the cottonwood tree. A fire burned brightly in a communal pit, its light warm and welcoming. Jed walked back into his cabin. He took the old framed photograph of Sarah and Sammy from the dusty chest, where he had kept it hidden, and placed it on the mantel of the newly built fireplace. He looked at their smiling faces no longer as symbols of an agonizing loss, but as the cherished memory of a past that had finally been honored. He looked out the window at the new life taking root on his land, at the merging of two families, two cultures under the vast star-filled sky. His future, which for so long had been a barren wasteland, was just beginning.